The outpost had 3 walls left standing, and a coffee machine that still worked, which Sergeant James Holt considered either a miracle or a personal insult from the universe. He stood with his hands loosely raised, watching the last wisps of plasma smoke curl upward through the collapsed ceiling into a sky the color of a bad bruise. And he thought, with the particular clarity that arrives only in moments of complete disaster, that he should have taken the desk posting on Callaway Station when he'd had the chance. The Solendi soldiers moved with unsettling precision. No shouting, no posturing, just quiet, efficient repositioning, like a machine tidying up after itself. One of them gestured at James with something that might have been a weapon or might have been a very aggressive stapler. The translator implant behind his ear clicked, warmed, and then offered him the word asterisk, compliance, in a tone that suggested the concept was non-negotiable. James complied. He was processed through 3 separate holding facilities over the following 40 hours, each one progressively colder and more aggressively beige. At the second facility, his translator implant briefly malfunctioned and informed him that a guard had called him asterisk, a reasonable quantity of milk. At the third, he was given a foil blanket and a document to sign that was 11 pages long. He signed it. He had no idea what it said. He suspected it didn't matter. It was at the third facility that he first heard her name. He hadn't asked. He'd simply been sitting against a wall, cataloging his remaining possessions, 1 boot with a broken clasp, a bruise forming magnificently along his left ribs, and a single ration bar he was rationing with more discipline than the situation technically required, when 2 Solendi guards passed close enough for his implant to catch their exchange. The word came through first in their tongue, angular and clipped, and then in his, Vaelith. The guards didn't slow down, but one of them glanced back, briefly, in the direction James had come from, as though checking that whatever was behind him hadn't somehow followed the name into the room. He was loaded onto a transit vessel before he could ask anyone to elaborate. The ship was dark and smelled of something metallic and faintly organic, like a hospital that had recently won a battle. He sat in a cargo restraint beside a crate of what he hoped was equipment, watched stars blur past a small viewport, and decided that speculation was probably more dangerous than ignorance. He was good at waiting. Soldiers were, when they had no other options. The vessel docked with a larger ship after what his internal clock estimated was 6 hours. The corridor that received him was immaculate. The kind of immaculate that isn't cleaned so much as asterisk enforced. 2 guards fell into step beside him without a word, and the doors at the corridor's end slid open with the smooth indifference of something that had never once malfunctioned. She stood with her back partially turned, studying a holographic display that filled one wall with star maps and data columns. She was tall, not unusually so, but with a stillness that made the room feel organized around her. Her uniform was dark, undecorated in any way James could identify as ceremonial, and her ears long, tapered, rising to elegant points that caught the cold blue light of the display, moved, just slightly as he was brought in. Like an antenna acquiring a signal, she did not turn around immediately. James stood in the silence, hands at his sides, and waited. The star maps glowed. Somewhere deep in the ship, something hummed with vast mechanical patience. Then, without turning, she spoke. His implant translated it in a flat, even tone, stripped of whatever her voice actually carried. "You are smaller than the report suggested." James considered several responses. He selected the safest one. "I get that a lot," he said. The cell was nicer than his apartment had been on Kerrigan Base, which James felt said something unflattering about the Outer Rim housing budget. There was an actual mattress, a sanitation unit that responded to voice commands and didn't require 3 attempts and a firm kick. The lighting adjusted automatically, dimming in what he assumed were the ship's night cycles, and the wall to his left was faintly warm to the touch, which was either a heating element or the ship was alive, and he was choosing not to think about that. He did push-ups. It seemed like the right response to an unknowable situation. On the second day, he was counting by sleep cycles, which was imprecise but better than nothing. A junior officer came to deliver his meal and stayed approximately 40 seconds too long, which James had learned to recognize as the universal sign of someone who wanted to talk. The officer was young by any standard he could apply, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone managing 17 responsibilities and fully understanding maybe 4 of them. His name, the translator offered, was something with too many consonants, which eventually simplified itself, through a series of polite negotiations, to Drevik. Drevik brought food that was nutritionally adequate and visually upsetting, set it down with the careful precision of someone diffusing something, and then said that the commander had reviewed James's service record. James looked up from the floor where he had been doing push-up number 41, and Drevik's ears, shorter than Vaelith's and considerably more expressive, pressed back slightly. The translator caught the next part as, she described it as unspectacular. That's fair, James said, and went back to push-ups. Drevik came back the following day with a slightly larger portion and the unprompted information that Commander Vaelith had not lost a single engagement in 11 years of active command. James received this the way one receives weather reports about places one cannot leave, with acknowledgement and no particular ability to act on it. He asked instead if there was anything to read. Drevik looked at him as though he had requested something faintly exotic, like a live animal, but returned 2 hours later with a data tablet loaded with what appeared to be Solendi navigational theory, and inexplicably, a manual on agricultural irrigation systems. It was better than nothing. James read the irrigation manual twice. What he was actually doing, underneath the mundane routine he was constructing with great deliberateness, was watching. The cell had no viewport, but the door had a gap at its lower seal, and sound carried through the ship's corridors with surprising fidelity. He learned the shift changes by footstep rhythm. He learned that something in the port engine cluster was slightly out of tune, a harmonic that no one else seemed to notice or care about, a small mechanical complaint that repeated every 4 minutes like a shy cough. He learned that Drevik walked faster when Vaelith was on the same deck, and slower when she wasn't, and that this was probably useful information of some kind. He also learned, through careful accumulation of overheard fragments and Drevik's occasional unguarded commentary, pieces of her. Not the reputation. The reputation arrived fully assembled and required no research. 11 years, 40-something engagements. A particular battle at a place his translator rendered as the mouth of Saravan, where she had held a defensive line for 9 days with a fleet half the required size, and the cost of it had apparently been significant enough that people still went quiet when it came up. What interested James more was what Drevik hadn't said with words. The way the crew moved around her schedule rather than simply within it. The way even senior officers seemed to recalibrate slightly in her proximity, like instruments adjusting to a stronger signal. On the 5th day, staring at the warm wall and listening to the engine's small repeated complaint, James arrived at a thought he hadn't expected. She was tired. He didn't know how he knew it. He hadn't seen her since that first corridor, hadn't exchanged another word. But something in the architecture of the ship's routines, in the silence that surrounded her movements, in the way Drevik sometimes paused before delivering information about her, something in all of it suggested a person carrying a weight that had been in place for a very long time. He filed that away, finished the irrigation manual for the 3rd time, and waited. The summons came on the 7th day, delivered by Drevik with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing his neutral expression for at least an hour and had not quite achieved it. He stood in the cell doorway holding a data chip and told James with careful evenness that the commander would see him now. Then he added, unprompted, that James should probably not make any jokes. James asked if that was an official order. Drevik's ears flattened slightly. It is a strong personal recommendation, the translator offered, and the two of them walked in silence through corridors that felt, to James, like the inside of a very organized mind. The room she received him in was not the bridge and not an interrogation suite, which eliminated both of his primary theories. It was something in between, a working space, spare and precise, with a long table and star charts that glowed softly along one wall like a window into everywhere the ship had ever been. Vaelith was already seated when he entered. She did not stand. She indicated the chair across from her with a gesture so minimal it was barely a movement at all, and James sat, and for a long moment neither of them said anything while the ship breathed quietly around them. She had a file open on the table's surface. His file, presumably. He resisted the urge to ask how the review was going. "You requested reading material," she said finally. His implant carried it flat and even the way it always did, scrubbing tone out of everything like a bureaucratic filter on reality. "I did," James said. "You read an irrigation manual." "Twice," he said. "3 times, actually. It has a satisfying structure." Something moved at the edge of her expression, not quite anything identifiable. She looked back at the file. "You repaired a defensive relay during the Kerrigan engagement." "Under active fire, with components from a vending machine." "The vending machine was already broken," James said. "I didn't make it worse." She studied him the way someone studies a calculation that keeps returning an unexpected result. Not with hostility exactly, with the particular attention of a person who has learned, through long experience, that anomalies tend to matter. Her long ears had stilled entirely. He'd noticed they moved when she was processing something and went still when she had decided to focus, and right now they were very still. "You are not afraid," she said. James considered the honest answer, which was that he was operating at a more or less continuous low frequency of fear that had simply become background noise at this point, like the engine's 4-minute complaint, and that mistaking functional terror management for actual courage was a very common error. He decided against explaining all of that. "I'm working on it," he said instead. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most prisoners request assurances, terms. They want to know the parameters of their situation." "I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know when you wanted me to know it," James said. "Asking questions you won't get answers to is just noise." Her head tilted, barely. "That is either very pragmatic or very foolish. In my experience, those are usually the same thing." What happened next was small enough that he almost missed it. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, present for less than a second before the careful stillness returned. It was, James thought, the most expensive-looking almost smile he had ever seen, like something she had taxed herself to produce and immediately reclaimed. She closed the file. She told him, with the same level precision she seemed to apply to everything, that the border conflict he had been captured in was being reviewed at a diplomatic level, and that his situation was therefore temporarily unresolved. He was not a bargaining piece, she said. He was a logistical condition. James nodded slowly. "That's the nicest way anyone's ever called me a loose end." This time she didn't almost smile. She simply looked at him for a moment with something that might, in another context, have been the very early and deeply reluctant beginning of respect. And then she told Drevik, who had been standing at the door with the suppressed anxiety of a man watching someone juggle something irreplaceable, to return James to his cell. James stood, nodded once in her direction, and walked out. Behind him he heard nothing. But in the corridor, Drevik exhaled like a man who had just survived something he hadn't fully understood, and that, James thought, was probably a good sign. It was Drevik who started it, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. James was in his cell working through a set of mental exercises he'd invented to keep his spatial reasoning sharp, essentially imagining the ship's layout from memory and cataloging everything he'd observed. When the lights shifted from their usual cold blue to a deep amber, and every surface that could vibrate began to, in a low, insistent way that moved up through the soles of his feet and settled unpleasantly at the base of his skull. An alarm, he understood, not a drill. Drevik appeared at his cell door approximately 90 seconds later, looking like a man who had been handed a problem significantly larger than his job description and had not yet found a place to set it down. He was talking before the door was fully open, his translator clicking rapidly to keep pace. There had been a navigational recalibration error. The ship had been executing a standard fold approach to a waypoint, and something in the sequencing had compounded. One small miscalculation feeding the next the way small miscalculations had a talent for doing. And now the approach vector was wrong in a way that mattered enormously. And the engineer responsible for the secondary correction array had been injured in the initial shudder. And James had a background in relay systems and field repair, and could he please come now? James was already standing. "Did you cause this?" he asked. Drevik's ears went very flat. "There were several contributing factors," the translator said carefully. "Drevik, I may have approved an update at an inadvisable moment." "Right," James said. "Let's go." The engineering corridor was loud and close and smelled of ozone, and something burning that everyone was pretending not to smell. The crew moved with the taut efficiency of people who were frightened but too well trained to show it in any way that would cost them time. James followed Drevik through 2 access hatches and down a ladder that was not designed for human proportions, and then he was at the secondary correction array, which was a mess of exposed relay architecture and blinking indicators. And he understood it, in the way that he understood broken things, not perfectly, not theoretically, but in the practical, tactile way that comes from having fixed too many things under conditions that didn't allow for failure. He worked. The ship shuddered again once, and then he worked through that too. Vaelith arrived 4 minutes in. He knew without looking the crew reorganized itself slightly. The ambient anxiety in the room changed pitch. She came to stand close enough to observe without interfering, and she watched him work with the same quality of attention she had turned on him across the table in her meeting room, that focused, recalculating quiet. He fixed it in 11 minutes. The amber lighting died. The vibration stopped. In the sudden comparative silence, someone on the crew exhaled audibly, and someone else said something his translator rendered as an extremely creative expression of relief. James sat back on his heels and looked at the restored relay array, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing being whole again that had been broken, which was one of the few feelings he trusted completely. He became aware that Vaelith was crouching beside him, not standing over him, beside him, at the same level, looking at what he had done with an expression that had something in it he hadn't seen on her before. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition. "You were not required to do that," she said. "I was in the building," James said. She was quiet for a moment. Around them the crew moved back to their stations, Drevik somewhere behind them radiating the particular relief of a man who has been given a second chance he knows he doesn't entirely deserve. "The diplomatic review concluded this morning," Vaelith said. "Before the emergency, you are to be returned to human-controlled space within the week." James nodded slowly. He had expected this, in the abstract way one expects things that have been too uncertain to actually anticipate. He found that the feeling it produced was more complicated than simple relief, which he noted with the same honest attention he tried to apply to everything. "Was I what you expected?" he asked. She considered that with the seriousness she applied to everything worth considering. Her ears moved once slightly, in a way he had come to understand meant she was choosing words with care. "No," she said. "You were not." He nodded again. He thought about 11 years of battles, of decisions made in the cold mathematics of command, of a reputation built deliberately as armor. He thought about irrigation manuals and vending machine components, and a coffee machine standing in a 3-walled outpost like a small, absurd declaration that some things persist. "For what it's worth," he said, "you weren't what I expected either." She stood. He stood. The ship moved on around them, steady now, carrying them both forward through the dark at the same speed in the same direction, for a little while longer. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't an ending in any clean sense. But it was true, and James had learned, over a long career of broken things and field repairs, that true was usually the best material available, and that you could build something solid with it if you were careful. He followed her back toward the lit corridor, and Drevik fell into step beside him, and the ship hummed evenly,